The desert stretched like an old scar across the planet's dead side. Wind moaned through the bones of ruined towers, stirring up ash that hadn't moved in years. Nothing lived here, not really. No broadcasts, no patrols, no light, only metal skeletons and silence. But Riven was there, boots scraping across rusted grates, a makeshift respirator strapped tight to his jaw, his hands black with engine oil. He scavenged not because he wanted to, but because it was the only thing left. In this forgotten world, where war had kissed the sky and then turned away, there were still pieces of value buried beneath the wreckage. He had learned to spot anomalies, a pattern too perfect, a surface too smooth. He trusted the twitch in his gut more than any scanner. So when he saw the glint just beyond the ridge, half buried beneath collapsed cargo, it made him stop mid-step. The sun hung low, bleeding orange, behind cracked spires. Riven adjusted his goggles and climbed the rubble. That was when he saw it. Not a weapon, not scrap, a capsule. Metal smooth as breath, it seems unmarred by time. Unlike everything else in this graveyard, it was intact. It looked placed, as if something had tried to lose it quietly. Riven approached slowly, hand hovering over his pulse knife. The pod was about the length of a human body with curved glass, frosted from within. Vines had begun curling around its base, but they hadn't cracked it. A single red light blinked, still active. He crouched, wiped dust from the surface. And then, movement, just a flicker. Inside the capsule, a figure stirred beneath the frost. Riven froze. Human? Number. The silhouette was too slim. Limbs too long. Hair floated inside the gel, like strands of pale fire. The face was partly obscured by ice, but what he could see, skin faintly glowing violet, eyes silver even through the haze, did not belong to any species he had seen. A voice crackled from the capsule, faint and broken. "Do not sell." Riven blinked. "What?" The voice repeated, this time louder, clearer. "Do not sell me, please." His breath caught. Then came the worst sound in the world, one he recognized too well, a beacon ping. The capsule's locator had activated. Retrievers would be on the way. Not scavengers, not looters, collectors. Riven acted without thinking. He pulled the emergency lever on the side of the pod. With a hiss and a rush of steam, the seal broke. The glass split. The girl inside spilled forward into his arms, barely conscious. Her skin warm despite the cold, her breath shallow. She looked up at him, not in fear, but in quiet hope. "You are not them," she whispered. Then she collapsed. Riven looked around, adrenaline spiking. The ridge behind him lit with the first sign of a sky drone. Too late to vanish, too soon to understand. He hoisted the girl over his shoulder, cursed under his breath, and ran. The desert swallowed their footprints, but the capsule still blinked, waiting. The old pump station groaned beneath the weight of a rising wind. Riven kicked the door shut behind him and dropped the locking bar across the frame. Dust swirled in the fading light outside, already stained by the flickering beams of search drones slicing across the horizon. He laid her gently on the cot. Her skin shimmered faintly, like it remembered stars. Silver veins pulsed beneath violet tones, but her breath was shallow, fragmented. She looked less like a person, and more like something half-formed from music and memory. Riven grabbed the last emergency stim from his pack and injected it near her shoulder. She flinched, then gasped, eyes open, silver, blazing. She sat up too fast, hit the wall, gasped again, this time from fear. Her fingers clutched at the air, her body shook. "Hey," Riven said, raising both hands. "You're safe. I pulled you from the capsule." She stared at him, chest rising and falling. Then, in a voice that cracked like dry thunder, "Where is the chain?" "What chain?" he asked. Her eyes searched the room, wild. "The emotional bind, the neural collar." She stopped. Looked at her own wrists. They were bare. She stared at them for a long time, like someone who had just seen skin for the first time in years. "You are not them," she whispered. Riven nodded. "Number, I'm Riven. I found you in the dust." She tilted her head. "Riven, a human, from Sol origin." His brow furrowed. "You know my kind." Her voice went distant. "Your kind knows mine." She touched her temple, then flinched. "They're coming," she said. He stepped closer. "Who's coming?" She turned to face him fully now, her voice suddenly clear and sharp. "The ones who bought me." A cold beat passed between them. Then the power in the pump station flickered, and from outside, a whine echoed in the wind. Not wind, engines, low and fast, retrievers. Riven spun toward the window. "Damn it." He grabbed his scatter blade and shoved a coat toward her. "We have to go." But she didn't move. Instead, she stood calmly, watching her reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. "My name," she said slowly, "is Velzina. I am not a weapon, not a consort, not an artifact." She turned to him, and something shifted in the air. "I am the last blood of House Velis. I was born to feel so deeply that even empires could not look me in the eye without weeping. And they tried to buy that." Riven swallowed. "Can you walk?" "I can burn." He didn't ask what that meant. He opened the back hatch, and together they slipped into the dusk. Behind them, the station was already lit by the glow of descending ships. Vel paused, then reached out and touched his hand. A spark leapt between their skin. Not pain, not electricity. Something else. "You have sadness in you," she said. Riven froze. She met his gaze. "But you hide it well." "Like we all did once." He pulled his hand away, jaw tight. "We don't have time for this." But even as they ran, even as engines thundered behind them, Riven felt it. Something had begun. Not just a chase, a connection. And across the sky, somewhere deep in the network of the merchant clans, a console pinged, Asset 9, a Velis, signal reacquired, a voice responded smooth and hungry. "Send everything, I want her alive. And if there's a human involved," a pause, "burn him out." The sun had set hours ago, but the sky above the wasteland still glowed with streaks of blue and orange fire, burned trails from low-orbit ships hunting something too fragile to be allowed freedom. Riven and Velzina had been running non-stop since they left the pump station, their boots coated in red dust, their lungs filled with the dry sting of old metal and ash. Ahead of them rose the Black Ridge, a broken slab of earth, jagged and cratered from an ancient orbital strike. Beneath it, half buried in stone, loomed the rusting shell of what once was called Outpost 19. No one dared enter it now. Locals said it was haunted, cursed, a ruin soaked in lost blood, which made it perfect. Riven led the way down a broken stairwell into the outpost's underbelly, flashlight beam cutting through hanging cables and dust-draped terminals. Vel moved behind him without sound, her steps as light as breath, her silver eyes scanning every corner like she was reading echoes. "What was this place?" she asked. Riven kept his voice low. "Old command hub, used during the collapse, abandoned after everything fell apart. My dad said it used to house tactical cores, too dangerous to decommission." She touched a wall and shivered. They left more than steel behind. They reached the heart of the outpost, a chamber wide as a cathedral, with cracked floors and a massive hatch sealed by rust and code. On it was written in faded paint, X13, "Do not activate without directoral genome." Vel turned to Riven. "What is X13? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked up to the console beside the hatch, wiped away dust, and placed his hand on the biometric reader. The scanner blinked red, paused, then glowed green. Vel blinked. "What did you just do?" "I didn't know it would work," Riven said. "My dad worked black sites. I guess he left more in me than stories." The floor shook. The hatch opened. Steam hissed out like breath held for decades. Inside stood a titan, 10 feet tall. Sleek black armor laced with dormant blue veins. Its arms folded across its chest, head bowed, silent. Then its eyes lit. Twin circles of white fire, The voice that came was deep, calm, terrifying. Genomic match confirmed. Command designation, lineage Riven. Uploading directive map. Vel stepped back. That's a war-class sentinel. They were banned. The machine unfolded, one motion at a time, like a statue deciding to walk. Designation X-13. Operational. Awaiting purpose. Riven raised his chin. We're being hunted. Can you protect? The machine's head tilted, scanning Vel. Asset Velis. Emotional construct identified. High priority safeguard assigned. Defensive protocol initiated. A hum filled the room as its armor plates realigned. Then, almost gently, it said, I serve. Vel whispered, it remembers. From above, engines roared. The retrievers had found them. Riven turned to the machine. Time to move. X-13 stepped forward. Time to remind them what they buried. The wall behind the outpost cracked open, revealing a buried exit tunnel. X-13 led the way. Vel walked beside Riven, eyes wide. This thing, it doesn't just obey, it feels. Riven glanced at her. Like you? She nodded. But older, angrier, like a heart that was never allowed to beat until now. Outside, the drones descended. But for the first time since their escape began, Riven didn't run. He followed the machine into the dark. They stopped at the edge of the dead ridge, inside the remains of a grounded cargo hauler, swallowed by sand and time. It was quiet now. X-13 had stayed behind to divert the retrievers. Its last transmission, only 3 words, they will forget. Riven didn't ask what that meant. He just kept moving. But now, inside the warm hull, beneath a broken sky with no stars, they finally had silence. Vel sat on the floor across from him, legs folded, arms wrapped around herself. Her skin still glowed faintly in the dark, pale violet with soft silver pulses, like moonlight through water. But something was wrong. She was shaking. Riven leaned forward. Are you cold? She shook her head. Number just hollow. He reached into his bag, offered her a ration bar. She stared at it for a long time, then smiled sadly. It doesn't work like that. Riven frowned. Then what do you eat? Vel didn't answer right away. Instead, she touched the side of her neck, just below her ear, where a faint scar traced down her skin. They use this port to harvest from me, she said quietly. Not blood, not memories, not energy. She looked up, eyes shimmering. Emotion. Riven's throat went dry. They fed you feelings. She nodded. Joy, grief, desire. They would make me feel what they could not. For a price. I was their mirror, their drug. And when they were done, they left me numb. He didn't speak. She turned away. I don't need food. I don't need air. But if I go too long without contact, I begin to fade. Not my body, my mind. She reached out slowly. Fingers brushed against his wrist. Just a touch. Like static. A rush hit him. His mother's voice in the back of his mind. Laughter from years ago. The weight of solitude he didn't know he carried until now. In that moment, Vel wasn't feeding. She was remembering him. She pulled her hand back sharply. I'm sorry. Riven's voice was steady. You didn't take anything. You just looked. She nodded. It was beautiful. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, he took a deep breath. Why did they call you Starborn? Vel hesitated, then answered. Because my kind were born when the first stars burned out. We don't just feel, we carry. The grief of planets, the joy of people we've never met. And in the wrong hands, that's weaponized. Riven looked her in the eye. You're not a weapon. She stared at him. You're the first to say that. They sat in silence. Then Vel whispered, voice so quiet, it almost vanished. When you touched me, I saw you. He tilted his head. What did you see? She smiled. Someone who never stopped caring, even when the world stopped deserving it. He chuckled, dry. I stopped a long time ago. She shook her head. Number you buried it. That's different. Outside, distant engines stirred again. They would have to run soon. But Riven wasn't afraid anymore, because now he knew she didn't need protection from the world. They stopped at the edge of the dead ridge, inside the remains of a grounded cargo hauler, swallowed by sand and time. It was quiet now. X-13 had stayed behind to divert the retrievers. Its last transmission, only 3 words: "They will forget." Riven didn't ask what that meant. He just kept moving. But now, inside the warm hull, beneath a broken sky with no stars, they finally had silence. Vel sat on the floor across from him, legs folded, arms wrapped around herself. Her skin still glowed faintly in the dark, pale violet with soft silver pulses, like moonlight through water. But something was wrong. She was shaking. Riven leaned forward. "Are you cold?" She shook her head. "Number just hollow." He reached into his bag, offered her a ration bar. She stared at it for a long time, then smiled sadly. "It doesn't work like that." Riven frowned. "Then what do you eat?" Vel didn't answer right away. Instead, she touched the side of her neck, just below her ear, where a faint scar traced down her skin. "They used this port to harvest from me," she said quietly. "Not blood, not memories, not energy." She looked up, eyes shimmering. "Emotion." Riven's throat went dry. "They fed you feelings," she nodded. "Joy, grief, desire. They would make me feel what they could not. For a price. I was their mirror, their drug. And when they were done, they left me numb." He didn't speak. She turned away. "I don't need food. I don't need air. But if I go too long without contact, I begin to fade. Not my body, my mind." She reached out slowly. Fingers brushed against his wrist. Just a touch, like static. A rush hit him. His mother's voice in the back of his mind, laughter from years ago, the weight of solitude he didn't know he carried until now. In that moment, Vel wasn't feeding. She was remembering him. She pulled her hand back sharply. "I'm sorry." Riven's voice was steady. "You didn't take anything, you just looked." She nodded. It was beautiful. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, he took a deep breath. "Why did they call you Starborn?" Vel hesitated, then answered, "Because my kind were born when the first stars burned out. We don't just feel, we carry. The grief of planets, the joy of people we've never met. And in the wrong hands, that's weaponized." Riven looked her in the eye. "You're not a weapon." She stared at him. "You're the first to say that." They sat in silence. Then Vel whispered, voice so quiet, it almost vanished. "When you touched me, I saw you." He tilted his head. "What did you see?" She smiled. "Someone who never stopped caring, even when the world stopped deserving it." He chuckled, dry. "I stopped a long time ago." She shook her head. "Number you buried it, that's different." Outside, distant engines stirred again. They would have to run soon. But Riven wasn't afraid anymore, because now he knew. She didn't need protection from the world. The world needed protection from forgetting her. The sun rose slow and red across the sand sea, bleeding light into the broken hull of the cargo hauler, like a whisper through old scars. Velzina sat in that light with her eyes closed, her breath steady, her hands resting on her knees. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The air around her shimmered faintly. Riven watched from a distance, arms crossed, leaning against the wall. He hadn't slept. Not really. His mind was still reeling, not from fear, but from understanding. She wasn't just alien. She wasn't just different. She was old, not in years, in weight. Vel finally opened her eyes. "I remember now," she said softly. He stepped closer. "Remember what?" She turned toward him. "My name is Velzena, daughter of Matron Alari of the Velis line. I was born on Oria in the time of silk and fire. I am the last heir to the memory born, and my people are gone." Riven sat across from her. "You said you were sold." "I was," she replied, "but only after they killed my mother. after they shattered our archives, after they made sure no one remembered who we were. They didn't want me for ransom. They wanted me as product, a way to feel what they had forgotten how to feel. She looked out the broken window toward the dunes. We were called the Starborn, not because we came from stars, but because we held them. Every one of us carried fragments of memory, passed from generation to generation. Joy, grief, wonder, raw, unfiltered. To touch us was to touch 1,000 lives. Riven was silent. She smiled faintly. But that kind of truth is dangerous. Truth always is, he said. Vel tilted her head, studying him. You don't fear me. I don't know enough to fear you. She reached out again, this time not to feed, but to offer. Riven took her hand. And in that touch, he saw, not in words, in sensations. A mother singing to her daughter beneath a sky of golden vines, a field of silver grass where children danced in silence, a great hall burning, and the silence that followed. Then, the cage, the taste of steel, the weight of isolation, the cold hands of buyers who didn't want a person, just a feeling. Riven pulled back, breath caught in his throat. You carry all of that? Vel nodded. Until now, alone. He looked down at his hands. And now? She smiled. Now I remember who I am. A soft beep echoed through the holler. Kalo's old transmitter, one Riven had repaired out of habit, lit up with an incoming signal. But it wasn't random. It pulsed in perfect rhythm. 3 tones, then 4, then 2. Vel went still. That's Velis code, she said. But you said your people are gone. They are, she whispered. Then she stood. Unless someone else remembers too. Riven grabbed his gear. Where's it coming from? She turned toward the eastern horizon. A place they once tried to erase, but memory doesn't burn easy. Riven followed her outside. The wind had picked up again, whispering across the sand. But this time it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a name. Starborn, and it had returned. The sky turned silver before the first ship appeared. Riven stood on a high ridge, his eyes narrowed against the light. No sound, no engine roar, just a gleaming vessel descending with the slow arrogance of something that had never been refused. Its hull was obsidian smooth, marked only by a single crest, a closed eye surrounded by teeth. Velzina stood beside him, her expression unreadable. They found us, she said. Your signal, he asked. No, she replied. My awakening. More ships followed, 4, then 6, forming a perfect circle in the air above the canyons. Light rippled around them, like the sky was too afraid to reflect what it saw. Then the lead vessel opened, and from its belly came them. The merchants. They did not walk, they floated, gliding inches above the ground, robes of polished fiber sweeping silently behind them, faces masked in glass, eyes not blinking, skin synthetic and gleaming. They looked like gods. They smelled like nothing. The lead one lowered its hood. Female form, beautiful, dead behind the eyes. You belong to us, she said to Vel, her voice so smooth it felt like poison running through silk. Vel did not flinch. I was sold, she answered. But I never belonged. The merchant tilted her head. You were the most expensive taste ever purchased. Vel's eyes flared silver. You never tasted me. Only what I allowed. The merchant moved closer. Riven stepped forward, hand on his blade. The air grew heavy. We gave you purpose, the woman said. You gave us feeling. What more could you desire? Vel's voice dropped low, cold. Choice. A hum built in the air. The merchant gestured, and the guards stepped forward, tall, faceless enforcers, wrapped in kinetic armor, each with a memory slicer affixed to their wrist. Return, or he dies. Vel looked at Riven, and something changed, not in her body, in the air around her. It rippled, like light bending, like heat, remembering what it meant to burn. Her voice was calm. I am Velzina of Velis. daughter of Alari, last carrier of the true lineage, and I do not return. I rise." She raised her hands. Silver light erupted from her palms, not as a weapon, but as emotion. The guards stopped mid-step. One staggered, then dropped to his knees. Another screamed, cried, clutching his chest, gasping as if feeling heartbreak for the first time in a life that had never known it. The merchant snarled. "You are outnumbered." Vel stepped forward, hair floating like stardust, light trailing from her skin. "No," she said. "I'm finally counted." And with one final surge, she pressed her palm to the ground. A wave of raw memory exploded outward. Not fire, not destruction, feeling. Every drone froze. Every ship flickered. Every merchant felt. The lead woman stumbled back, clutching her chest. "What is this?" Vel's voice was soft. "Loneliness." Then the silence swallowed them. The ships powered down. The merchants fled. And Vel fell to her knees, breath shaking. Riven caught her. She looked at him. Eyes still glowing. Voice barely a whisper. "I didn't hurt them." He smiled. "Number you made them feel. That's worse." She rested her head against his shoulder. And for the first time they both believed it. They arrived at dusk. The city of Halvex rose from the sands like a blade. Tall, sharp, reflective, every surface engineered to blind rather than welcome. Once a cultural sanctuary, it had become the most infamous black market hub in the quadrant. Riven had only heard stories, children auctioned for memory stimulation, creatures kept in sensory tanks to be tasted by the elite. No blood, no bruises, just feelings sold in glass. And tonight, Velzina had chosen to walk into its heart. She wore no disguise. She wore herself. Her hair shimmered silver under the neon haze, her skin faintly radiant. She walked beside Riven, chin raised, gaze unwavering. With each step, sensors flickered, hidden cameras turned. And the whole city began to whisper, "The Starborn is alive." They didn't sneak into the auction. They entered. The arena was a perfect circle of black marble, filled with nobles seated in hovering thrones. Below them, cages lined the inner wall, each containing a being too tired to scream. A voice echoed through the chamber. "We welcome the long-awaited return of Velis stock, and tonight we offer you the rarest delicacy, the last Starborn." A hush fell. Vel stepped forward and spoke. "You no longer remember us. That's fine. I am here to remind you." Laughter rippled through the nobles. "You think words will stop the exchange?" one asked. "No," she said, lifting her palm, "but this will." A pulse erupted from her skin. Not force, emotion. Instantly, the guards dropped their weapons, not from attack, but from what they felt. Grief, joy, regret. 1,000 years of denied memory flooded the room like light into a prison. The nobles recoiled. One screamed, "This isn't allowed." Vel stepped into the arena's center, arms open. "You bought our pain, but never our truth. You fed on echoes, not essence." Cages around her began to unlock, softly, one by one. The imprisoned blinked, stood, stepped out, not like victims, like witnesses. A child with green skin walked to Vel's side and took her hand. A warrior with rusted implants knelt beside her. And the nobles, they tried to flee, but found the doors sealed. Vel spoke again. "I am not here to kill you." Her voice was soft now. "I'm here to make you see." She released one final wave, not explosive, but pure. The arena filled with feeling. And the nobles wept, not from injury, but from awakening. Hours later, Riven found her standing alone, where the auction once operated. He said nothing. She looked at him. "They cried," she said. "I saw," he replied. "I didn't expect it to feel so heavy." He nodded. "Truth usually is." They turned together, watching as the freed captives began to walk out of the city. Some would vanish, some would rebuild, but none would forget. Because once, in a place built to sell pain, someone had given it back. The city burned behind them, not with flame, with light, soft, gold, alive, pouring from shattered towers and broken arenas, from every memory chamber Velzena had touched. It spilled like dawn into places long kept in the dark. No one screamed, no sirens wailed, only silence, the kind left behind when truth has been spoken and cannot be taken back. Vel stood on the edge of the tallest spire, wind brushing through her silver hair, her gaze cast across the horizon, where stars began to blink awake one by one. Below her, survivors of the auction walked free. Some wept, some just breathed, but all of them moved like people who remembered what it felt like to matter. Riven stood beside her, his coat dusty, blade still slung at his side, eyes tired but steady. "So what now?" he asked. Vel looked up, where the stars reflected faintly in her eyes. "We send a message," she said. "To who?" "To everyone." She turned and knelt beside a collapsed transmitter tower, ancient, rusted, but functional. Riven watched as she rewired it with fingers that pulsed soft silver at each touch. When it hummed to life, she stepped back and reached into her coat, pulled out a crystal, small, fractured, but burning faint blue. "Is that—" "Yes," she whispered. "The archive. One of the last. My mother hid it inside me before they took me. I didn't know it survived until today." She slotted it into the tower. The screen blinked, then words appeared, in every major tongue ever spoken across the known galaxy. "Starborn has returned. She is not alone." Vel pressed a button, and the signal went out. Through every old relay, every forgotten beacon, every broken system still listening, across planets still ruled by fear, into bunkers where others like her, hidden, sleeping, scared, had waited for a sign that they were not the last. "Do you think they'll hear it?" Riven asked. "They will feel it," Vel said. And they did. In a gas mine on Juno 3, a child with glowing eyes looked up and whispered her name. On a station above a dying moon, a slave in a sealed vault saw the words flash and broke his collar for the first time. On Earth, long abandoned, a garden bloomed where none had grown for decades. Vel turned from the console. "I'm done running," Riven nodded. "Then we stand." "No," she said softly. "We walk forward, together." She took his hand. The signal kept pulsing. And somewhere beyond the stars, someone else replied. "Would you carry your pain into the open if it meant others could breathe? Would you light a signal for strangers who only know your silence? Share your thoughts. Was this a rebellion, or the first breath of a future finally ready to feel?"